me try like this. Maybe it's better. Okay. So, technical. Again, so why do we have a strategy? Three important reasons that you can hopefully see on the screen. The first one is obviously this commission is very much focusing on sustainability. I think all of you will be familiar with the European Green Deal, this commitment or this ambition from the Commission to reduce the environmental footprint of the European industry, of the European society at large. And when looking into sustainability, environmental impact, textile industry is obviously one sector that is on the radar. So it fits within that ambition to address, to reduce our environmental impact. That is clear. At the same time, this commission is also trying to support or try to develop an industrial strategy and trying to strengthen a number of strategic sectors of the European economy. And as you can see in the middle, textiles has been considered as a strategic and important sector of the European economy. And so there is that, if you want, ambition, that interest to support the European textile industry, to make it more competitive, to make it more resilient. And then thirdly, this commission here in Brussels has also changed, adapted its view, its relations with third parties, with countries around the world, and developed a more, I would say, assertive trade policy. So moving from years ago, a kind of an open, very free trade focused agenda towards an agenda that is a bit more critical in our relations with third countries, more critical on compliance with social standards, with environmental standards, and also that element, so that change and strategy has an impact on the textile strategy. So based on those three pillars, focus on sustainability, making it more resilient, and probably a different relationship with the rest of the world. This strategy has presented a vision. You know, where does the Commission want the textile industry, the textile ecosystem, where does it want to be in 2030? And it's very important. I put on this again. I don't know if you can read it properly, but it's very important to go through those 5 specific points that you can see, because it really summarizes the essence of that vision. So the first point: all textile products placed on the EU market are durable, repairable, and recyclable, to a great extent made of recycled fibers, free of hazardous substances, produced respecting social rights. So you really need to read this very carefully. This is how Europe, how the European Union would like textile products to look like, to be, this is how they should be produced. Any products that enter the European market, which means it's not just products produced by European manufacturers, it's regardless where they are produced, they shall be durable, repairable, recyclable, etc. That is the very broad vision. Second point, which is a bit of a slogan, which Vice President of the European Commission, Mr. Timmermans, used when presenting this strategy: fast fashion is out of fashion, and consumers benefit longer from high quality textiles. So the Commission really wants to push the market and the consumers towards purchasing higher quality, more durable, long-lasting textile and apparel products. Number 3, profitable reuse and repair services are widely available. So really push this repair and reuse, so longer use of textile products. In a competitive, resilient, and innovative textile sector. So very much pushing or promoting what I mentioned before about the resilience, promoting, strengthening the industrial competitiveness of textile companies, whereby producers take responsibility for their products along the value chain. So again, it's increasing transparency and insisting that the consumer has a right to know how a product has been made, with a new label, with new transparency, but at the same time insist that we need to make an effort to help European textile companies to be competitive, to be resilient, to be innovative. The fifth point is essentially promoting or accompanying the industry to move from a traditional linear business model towards a more circular business model. So circularity, recycling becomes central, or is a central element of this whole textile strategy, which of course implies that we develop sufficient capacities for recycling, and we avoid incineration, landfilling, shipping textile waste outside Europe. So all that has to stop. So that is very much, in essence, the vision how Europe wants to push the sector in that direction. Now, what is important to understand for all of us is that this is not just a vision. These are not, I would say, just fancy words. This vision is being translated into hard legislation. So as we speak, there is a long list of regulation, restrictions, rules, standards that are being developed, which I would say put into practice what I presented in that vision. And I will not go through the entire list that you, again, I hope you can see on the screen. That, for example, the first one is eco-design regulation, which is on the table already today as a draft, will really dictate how you produce a textile product, from its components, its composition, how you communicate about that production process, the responsibility you will have for your supply chain, how you will communicate with the consumers, will introduce a new label, a new kind of benchmark, an environmental framework. So again, it will dictate, if you're in the textile and apparel industry, it will dictate how you produce your products and how you organize yourself as a textile company. Linked to that, there is discussion on establishing a product environmental footprint. I think many people are probably familiar with the concept. So trying to establish I would say, an objective framework, a reference to decide what is now the footprint of producing a t-shirt or a trousers, and how do you measure that? There will be extended producer responsibility. So European Union is imposing to member states to introduce a kind of a levy, a tax on the end of use for apparel products. It already exists in France, and it will come up in all other member states. So a kind of a levy that should be used to organize recycling of apparel products. There is due diligence legislation coming, which refers essentially to the responsibility that you will have towards your entire supply chain, your sourcing. The Commission would like to have a unique digital product passport for every textile product which is being produced, so that you can have this unique identifier offering the full details of the production process, the materials used, where they come from, the qualities, all put together in such a passport. The strategy wants to address the ongoing discussion on microplastics and how to avoid the unintentional release of microplastics. Big discussions on how to restrict certain chemicals, the use of certain chemicals, addressing the overproduction issue and overconsumption, trying to introduce a new green eco label, which will maybe overlap with many existing labels, etc. So the message that I would like to bring across to all of you is that the textile industry is moving from a fairly unregulated sector to a very regulated sector. That obviously creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of questions, but that trend, that change is happening. Along with this legislative train that is now coming, because the train is even longer than what you see on the slide. Along with that train, there is also what is called transition pathway. So the European Commission is also developing a kind of an action plan, how to organize that transition, how to accompany the industry in making that transition, in complying with this long list of regulations that is coming our way. And in this pathway, there is a lot of focus on that resilience element, what I mentioned before. So in essence, how to make sure that while those companies, textile companies, will need to make the transition, how can they remain competitive? How can they manage the cost, the effort of making that change, of complying with those new regulations? So the whole resilience question is very much on the table. What kind of support is needed? How to avoid that as a result of that regulatory process, the European textile industry would basically become less competitive than before. The level playing field is very important in this context, in the sense that if only European companies would comply with this increased or with putting the bar higher, so to speak, if only European companies follow that and other companies around the world do not comply, we obviously create a challenge of competitiveness. So we need to maintain that level playing field, which probably implies that we need to step up market surveillance, monitor how products which are produced outside Europe do comply with all those standards, with all those restrictions that I mentioned before. There is a lot of focus or discussion, at least, on what kind of investment is needed in innovation, in skills, in digitalization. Again, that would help the industry to make that transition, to make that, as we often mention here in Brussels, the green and digital transition. So how to prepare the companies to comply with that new framework and once again to remain competitive. So all this is on the agenda as we speak. It's a process, the regulation process, the regulatory process, and also developing this pathway will take several years. But the process, let's say the direction that it's taking is very clear. My last, I think, slide is to really share our vision. Speaking from Eurotech's perspective, how do we look at this fairly ambitious strategy from the European Union? And it's just focusing on three elements. This whole regulatory framework that I was summarizing in a few minutes is something that we are open, we welcome that framework, provided it offers a realistic framework that companies can comply with, a framework that is enforceable, that supports the SMEs, so being careful about the cost of compliance, and make sure it's coherent. So in other words, we're looking for a smart, or I would say a quality framework that is realistic and that helps the industry to move forward towards more sustainability, more transparency, etc. So the quality of the legislation will be critical in making this transition success. Secondly, as I mentioned before, we need support for our companies to make that transition. So we are pleading as Eurotex for a textile transition fund that will help the SMEs to invest in digitalization, to invest in people, to address the energy crisis that we are facing very much today. So there needs to be kind of a serious support package to help companies make that transition. And then finally, we need, of course, to make sure that when moving towards more sustainable textile products, we need to make sure that there is a demand, that there is a market for these products. And that's where, of course, the relationship with the brands, with the retailers are very important, because we need to inform the consumers about sustainable textile products. What does it mean? We need to explain why in some cases there might be an additional cost for sustainable textile products. We also need to work with the authorities when it comes to public procurement, because they talk a lot about green public procurement, but in practice, when it's about the army, hospitals, police force, when they put procurements, often the main criteria used is price, and not again the sustainability criteria that needs to be introduced in that. So we need to focus. We need to make sure that there is a demand, an increasing demand for sustainable products. So with those three criteria, a smart quality framework, support to the industry to make that transition, and making sure that there is a demand, we are optimistic that this whole transition for the textile industry can be successful. One final comment, all this, of course, has to happen in a global context. Once again, it cannot be only the European textile companies that would make this transition. From a competition, from a competitiveness perspective, that would be no good. So it's important that we cooperate with our partners, colleagues, and competitors around the world in this global textile ecosystem to make sure that all companies follow this trend towards more sustainable production, towards more transparency, towards more durability, and that we work together to create a framework that is transparent and where textile companies, whether they are based in Europe or anywhere on the planet, can compete in a free and fair environment. So that global context is obviously critically important. So that's in a nutshell, this whole textile strategy. And again, I try to compact it in a few minutes. But in essence, we are facing a dramatic change that is coming ahead. And I said it's a process that will happen in the next few years. We need to prepare ourselves as an industry for that change. We need to have a very close dialogue with the legislator in making sure, as I said before, that this legislation, this regulation is feasible, is actually helping the industry. But on those terms, in this condition, we are optimistic and we are positive that this change can actually help our industry to become more competitive and more sustainable at the same time. I'll stop here and open, obviously, to pick up some questions if that is technically, I hope, possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. Okay, we are clapping. Thank you for that really interesting presentation, Dirk, and thank you everyone for your patience with those technical issues there as well. We've only got a couple of minutes for questions, so if anyone does have one, then please raise your hand now. Just 1 second, Dirk, we're just getting the microphones.
Thank you, Dirk. It's Duncan from Epson. I just would like to understand whether there's been any timelines given for introduction of some of the regulations. You mentioned 2030, but nothing in between. So is there anything?
Sure. There's no, how to say, there's no clear-cut timetable that is available, partly because this legislative process is somehow unpredictable, in the sense that what happens is the European Commission drafting draft legislation, which is then put on the table for consultation with stakeholders like ourselves, but also involving the European Parliament, and ultimately involves member states. Then it depends on how much discussion there is, how much, I don't know, opposition, whatever is out there, and that has an impact on how fast that whole process is moving forward. In general terms, so having said that, in general terms, we expect the bulk of that legislation to be prepared and put in place over the next, I would say, 3-4 years. So it's not, well, I was about to say it's not tomorrow, but from an industry perspective, 3-4 years is relatively soon, because again, it will enforce quite substantial changes in the way we organize ourselves. There's also, it'll be, there are different pieces of legislation. Some will come sooner. The compulsory, collection of textile waste is already in place, deadline 2025. Other pieces will probably take a little bit more time. But so it's a process over the next few years. That's the generic answer that I can give at this stage.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I think we have another question.
Just a quick question about the global environment. So we're talking about Europe, but how do you see the US market being impacted or, following the European regulations, and what's the timeline for that, if you foresee it?
Yeah. So again, as I tried to explain, strictly speaking, any product that wants to be sold, placed on the single market, will have to comply with this new set of rules and standards. So US producers wanting to basically export into the EU will need to comply. That's a fact. Then whether this EU Textile Strategy and the vision behind all this towards promoting recycling, towards sustainability, etc., will that also serve as a reference, as a benchmark for example, the US market? That is to be seen. I can tell you, we are having discussions with our American counterparts. We have discussions with some countries in Asia who are interested to understand this EU strategy, and who are, shall I say, investigating if such a model, such a kind of vision should be implemented in these markets. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking with colleagues in Washington, where there are some discussions. We understand the US authorities do not yet have such an ambitious plan, at least not at US level. At some state level, there are some more local plans. But it's clear, or at least I think, this EU strategy may serve as, how to say, a source of inspiration for similar initiatives that may take place in other parts of the world.
Okay, thank you, Dirk. And just the final question over there, because we will hand over
thank
to our
you.
next speaker. Thank you.
My question is, a lot of, or parts of the regulatory framework that you mentioned seem like similar or part of GOTS or Ecotex standards, which are existing already. Why not embrace those existing standards rather than creating another one?
Yeah, very good, valid point, very good question. And as we enter into the technical negotiations and discussions, that is something that Eurotex certainly is putting on the table, has already put on the table, because we fully understand we already have too many labels, we have too many standards even, to some extent. So we cannot just add another layer and add complexity, adding costs for the producer, adding confusion, for the consumer. So the last thing is we want is to have just an extra complication. How that will then effectively happen, for example, this eco label, which is mentioned in the strategy, we don't know, and I think nobody knows. Again, the Commission has this vision to simplify things and to come down to bring it down to a single eco label. Whether that label would be built on the existing labels, whether there would be some kind of convergence between those different labels, all this is up to discussion and negotiation. So again, at this stage, I can only, echo what you said. We need to be careful not just to add another label, but how exactly that will materialize. Again, it's one of the many points of discussion that we will have in the coming months and even few years.
Okay. Thank you, Dirk. Another round of applause for Dirk, I think. And thank you for joining us. So
Okay.
now I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Jana van den Bergen.